You might think psychic powers belong in science fiction, but for over 2 decades, the United States government spent millions of dollars trying to develop them as an intelligence tool. And in 2017, the CIA quietly released thousands of pages that revealed just how seriously they took it. This isn't speculation, this is documented history. And the question isn't whether it happened. The question is why it happened, what they found, and why we're only now getting the full picture. Welcome to the story of Stargate. Not the movie. The operation. Let me take you back to 1972. The Cold War is at its height. American intelligence agencies received disturbing reports that the Soviet Union is pouring resources into parapsychology research. The concern isn't whether psychic phenomena are real. The concern is simpler and more urgent. What if the Soviets believe they're real, develop them first, and were left behind? This is the context that matters. The CIA wasn't staffed by mystics. They were responding to a perceived threat. And in the logic of Cold War intelligence, you couldn't afford to dismiss anything your adversary was taking seriously. So in 1972, the CIA approached the Stanford Research Institute, a respected scientific organization, and asked them to investigate whether extrasensory perception could be weaponized. They called it remote viewing. The ability to perceive distant locations using only the mind. For most people, this is where the story ends. Maybe you've heard the punchline. The government wasted money on psychics, realized it was nonsense, and shut it down. Case closed, but the declassified documents tell a more complicated story. The program didn't last a few months. It lasted 23 years. It wasn't a fringe operation. It involved the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and multiple military branches. It wasn't dismissed immediately. It was renewed, restructured, and relocated multiple times across 2 decades. And here's what makes this worth examining. The people running it weren't charlatans. They were physicists, intelligence officers, and credentialed researchers who designed protocols, conducted experiments, and documented their findings according to scientific standards. Now, let's be clear about what the documents actually show. The Stanford Research Institute conducted thousands of trials between 1972 and 1995. The lead researchers, physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell published their methodology in peer-reviewed journals. They brought in outside evaluators. They imposed controls to prevent fraud and unconscious cueing. They documented everything. And according to their reports, some test subjects produced results that exceeded statistical chance. Not every time. Not even most of the time. But often enough that dismissing it entirely became difficult for the evaluators. One declassified document describes operational use. In 1979, a remote viewer was reportedly asked to describe a Soviet facility. The viewer sketched a large gantry crane near water. Satellite imagery later confirmed a massive crane at a naval facility matching the description. Coincidence? Pattern recognition from previous briefings? Genuine anomaly? The document doesn't speculate. It simply records what happened. But here's where the complexity deepens. In 1995, the CIA commissioned the American Institutes for Research to conduct an independent review. Their conclusion was carefully worded. Remote viewing had not been proven effective enough for intelligence operations. They acknowledged some statistically significant results in laboratory conditions, but found that operational use had produced no actionable intelligence that couldn't be attributed to other factors. The program was terminated. The official narrative became interesting laboratory curiosity, but ultimately not useful. So, why are we talking about this in 2017? Because that's when the CIA declassified and released over 12 million pages of documents, including the full Stargate archives. And researchers who VA studied them have pointed out something interesting. There is a gap between what was tested and what was concluded. The American Institutes for Research evaluated the program's operational intelligence value. That's a reasonable standard. But the declassified experimental logs show consistent results in controlled laboratory tests that multiple statisticians confirmed exceeded chance expectations. Those two things aren't contradictory. Laboratory results and field operations are different environments with different variables. What the documents reveal is this. The program produced statistically anomalous results that researchers could unfully explain, but it didn't produce reliable, actionable intelligence that justified continued funding. Here's the information gap worth examining. For over 20 years, while Stargate was classified, the public conversation about psychic phenomena was dominated by television psychics, paranormal entertainment, and obvious frauds. Serious scientific discussion was culturally stigmatized. Meanwhile, credentialed scientists were conducting controlled experiments with federal funding, publishing in academic journals, and documenting results that didn't fit easy explanations. The public didn't know because it was classified. The scientific community largely dismissed it because of the stigma, and the intelligence community continued funding it because they couldn't definitively prove it didn't work. This creates a strange situation. Documented evidence of unexplained results, archived in government files, neither proven nor disproven, and largely ignored by mainstream discourse. What do the documents actually establish? They establish that over 23 years, multiple intelligence agencies took the possibility seriously enough to fund extensive research. They established that controlled experiments produced results that some statisticians found significant and others found inconclusive. They established that operational use did not produce actionable intelligence. And they established that, despite extensive investigation, researchers couldn't identify definitive mechanisms of fraud or fully explain the statistical patterns. That's not proof of psychic powers. But it's also not proof of complete failure. It's documentation of an unresolved question. Multiple researchers have noted that the program's termination coincided with budget cuts and shifting priorities after the Cold War. Not with definitive scientific disproof. The American Institutes for Research Evaluation focused on intelligence value, not on whether the laboratory results warranted further scientific investigation under different frameworks. So what does this mean for how we understand institutional knowledge and public awareness? It means that for over 2 decades, serious scientists were investigating a phenomenon that public culture treated as entertainment. It means classified research can operate in a parallel track to public understanding. And it means that even when documents are declassified, the information doesn't automatically reshape public conversation. Today, the Stargate documents sit in online archives. Researchers can read them. Journalists can cite them. But they have fundamentally changed the cultural conversation about whether consciousness can interact with physical reality in ways we do want to understand. Maybe that's because the documents don't provide clear answers. They provide detailed documentation of an ambiguous investigation, and we're not culturally comfortable with ambiguity. We want things to be proven or debunked, real or fake, worth attention or worth dismissing. But documented reality is often messier than that. Here is what I find most interesting about the Stargate files. They read a case study in how institutions handle uncertainty. The CIA didn't conclude that remote viewing was real. They didn't conclude it was fake. They concluded it wasn't operationally useful enough to justify the cost. That's a pragmatic intelligence decision, but it's not a scientific conclusion. The question the documents leave open isn't whether psychic powers are real. The question is whether consciousness interacts with information in ways our current models don't fully account for, and whether that question deserves continued scientific investigation outside the framework of intelligence operations. 23 years of research. 12 million pages of documents. And the conclusion is, we still don't know. That's not a failure of investigation. That's documentation of a genuine mystery. And maybe that's exactly the kind of thing that deserves wider public awareness. Not because it proves anything, but because it shows how much we still don't understand about the boundaries of human perception. And because understanding what our institutions investigated, how they investigated it, and why they stopped tells us something important about how knowledge gets created, classified, and released. The documents are public now. You can read them yourself. You can examine the experimental protocols. You can review the statistical analysis. You can draw your own conclusions. And maybe that's the real revelation here. That serious investigation of unexplained phenomena happened, was documented extensively, and exists now in the public record for anyone willing to look at the actual evidence, rather than the cultural narrative. The files are open. The question remains, what do you think the evidence actually shows?